Hello everyone, welcome back. It is Jessa, and today we are discussing a myth, the fall of Icarus. Now I have what we're going to start with, which is this Edith Hamilton mythology reader. Some of you may recognize it from primary school, because it's a primary school reader to help children understand mythology. But for me, it's just the perfect, just kind of compilation of all of the important myths you hear about, but might not understand in full. So we'll take a look at this. We'll then, after that, look at some famous representations of the fall of Icarus, particularly Auden, his poem about it, which is right here. We're going to look at that. And the painting that he based that poem off of by Bruegel, a Dutch painter from the 1500s who painted the fall of Icarus. This painting here, and I know it's not in color, which is a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Paper sounds. It's a total tragedy, but I'm going to kind of put it on the video when we get to it. So this is the painting that we're going to look at. This is the representation of the fall of Icarus. It's a very famous, very beautiful painting, so you may have already seen it. But it's actually, I think, honestly, my favorite painting, because whenever I look at it, I just like it's so thematic and resounding in its message. So that's why we're going to take a look at that one. Okay. So I'll begin with a brief history of the myth. To understand the fall of Icarus, you need to understand, like, the maze, right, that Daedalus was placed in with his son and why he was placed there. And so you actually have to kind of go back to the king of Greece. So we're going to start, sorry, not the king of Greece, the king of Athens. So we're actually going to start there with Theseus, the story of Theseus, because he's a really essential part of the fall of Icarus, like kind of the prequel to the fall of Icarus. So we'll learn about Theseus. I also think that Theseus is just an important figure when we think about what good leadership is. So it's really nice to look at this representation of a king who is for the poor, a king who is for the weak, a king who is interested in protecting his people. So that's what we'll read here. But a king, of course, who was impeded, or his fatal flaw, his hamartia, essentially, was his love of danger. He loved danger more than anything in the world. So we'll learn about him first. Okay? So we'll start there. This is a very old and crinkly book, and I have a lot of different post-it notes in it. We're going to go to Theseus here. You can see all my post-it notes. Theseus. The great Athenian hero was Theseus. He had so many adventures and took part in so many great enterprises that there grew up a saying in Athens, "Nothing without Theseus." He was the son of the Athenian king Aegeus. He spent his youth, however, in his mother's home, a city in southern Greece. Aegeus went back to Athens before the child was born, but first he placed in a hollow a sword and a pair of shoes and covered them with a great stone. The knowledge of his wife... Oh, sorry, I skipped a page. He did this with the knowledge of his wife, and told her that whenever the boy, if it was a boy, grew strong enough to roll away the stone and get the things beneath it, she could send him to Athens to claim him as his father. The child was a boy, and he grew up strong, but far beyond others, so that when his mother finally took him to the stone, he lifted it with no trouble at all. She told him then that the time had come for him to seek his father, and a ship was placed at his disposal by his grandfather. But Theseus does not want to go by water because water is too easy. Because Theseus, of course, this is where we learn his major flaw is that he loves danger. He loves pushing things to the limit. He'll never take the easy path. He'll always try and prove himself by doing the hardest thing. So he goes by land. And it was a very long and hazardous journey, right, by land, which was the point. So he got what he wanted. And so he met a lot of bandits on the road, and these are Greek bandits, so they're very magical bandits. And Edith Hamilton actually has a really good kind of idea of why these stories are so magical and fun and entertaining. And she thinks it's because of the Greeks or the ancient people's connection to nature, that they saw so much more mystery in people. And so even in evil, there was something extraordinary about evil. There was something extraordinary about everything. So that's just what makes it a little bit different. Anyway, keep reading. So these bandits, how he punished them is not at all unlike how people are punished in hell. They're usually punished in the way that they committed the deed, the misdeed. So basically, the misdeed is then committed against them in a twisted, kind of a sordid, double, almost like an uncanny reflection of what they had done. So his idea of dealing justice was simple, but effective. What each had done to others, Theseus did to him. Sciron, I don't know how to pronounce that, for instance, who had made those he captured kneel to wash his feet and then kick them down into the sea, Theseus hurled over a precipice. Sinis, who killed people by fastening them to 2 pine trees, bent down to the ground and letting the trees go, died in that way himself. Procrustes was placed upon the iron bed which he used for his victims, tying them to it and then making them the right length for it by stretching those who were too short and cutting off as much as necessary from those who were too long. That is the oddest form of murder. He's just trying to get someone who doesn't fit a bed to fit a bed. What? All right. So, this is how he killed them. He killed them the way that they killed people. So, when Greece heard of the young man who cleared the realms of all of these annoying bandits who kill people when they're just trying to go, between cities on foot, he became incredibly popular. Okay, and when he made it to the King Aegeus, right, in Athens, King Aegeus did not know that Theseus was his son because King Aegeus had not seen the sword and the shoes that are supposed to say, "This is your son." So he was afraid of the young man's popularity, right? Worried that this man, Theseus, might win over the people, and the people would wish him to be king instead of King Aegeus. So King Aegeus is very worried, and with a little bit of help of Medea, who has captured the ear of Aegeus and knows, because she knows all, because she's a woman and women know everything all the time, she knows that Theseus is King Aegeus' son, but she also knows if she tells King Aegeus that Theseus is his son, that Medea will lose all her influence. So she doesn't want Aegeus to know. So Medea says, "We'll poison him." But the moment that the poison is in Theseus' hand, Aegeus notices the sword. And the king realizes it and dashes the poison cup from Medea, and Medea runs away, because Medea always gets away. She runs away to Asia or something. So, now Theseus is the son. He's the heir to the kingdom, right? And so, Theseus must prove himself to King Aegeus And this is where we're introduced to the world that will reveal to us Icarus. Icarus with Daedalus in King Minos' maze. Okay, so while King Aegeus hosted Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, right? So Crete is a little island below Athens. Rather, actually, a pretty large island. He's the ruler of Crete, and his son Androgeus goes to visit King Aegeus, and King Aegeus sent his guest on an expedition full of peril to kill a dangerous bull. Why would you do this to a guest? I don't know. Neither did King Minos. And unfortunately, King Minos' son died on this terrible journey. He was killed by the bull. And so King Minos is furious, and mourning the death of his son under King Aegeus' watch, he sends Crete to invade Athens, to capture it, and declare that he would raze it to the ground unless every 9 years the pitbull of Athens sent him 7 maidens and 7 youths. So the Athens would only survive if they sacrificed the youth to Crete. Okay. When they reached Crete, they would go to the Minotaur, and the Minotaur is half monster, half bull. So we have this really cool depiction of the Minotaur here. The reason I love this book is of all the cool illustrations. So here's the Minotaur, half man, half bull. And how we come to have the Minotaur is, of course, a very strange story in itself. Okay, so the Minotaur is trapped in a maze crafted by Daedalus, a brilliant inventor. And King Minos asked this brilliant inventor to put the Minotaur in this maze because the Minotaur is very, very deadly and needs to be trapped, right? The Minotaur is half monster, half bull, half human, and is offspring of Minos' wife Pasiphae and a wonderfully beautiful bull. A little bit of bestiality, you know how it is. So Poseidon had given this bull to Minos as a gift, but hoping that Minos would sacrifice it to Poseidon. So it was a gift to the god Poseidon. And this is interesting, right? Because when we think about gods and why they exist, they always exist. Why they create people to worship them. And it's almost as if gods create people to prove their own existence. Like their own existence is so fragile, so small, that they need to create something beneath them in order to prove their own strength, which is kind of what we do, we feel so fragile, so precarious, that we always need to be able to look down on someone in order to believe in our own existence and our own primacy. So, yeah, it's kind of what we do. We are the Greek gods in a lot of ways, which is why I love how flawed the Greek gods are, because they really are just people with extraordinary power. But they contain all of the flaws of people. They're so imperfect. It's just that their imperfections are kind of like their superpowers. Anyway, their imperfections are what create action in the world, essentially. So, Poseidon gives this bull to Minos. Minos does not kill the bull. He likes it. He doesn't want to kill it, right? He keeps it in kind of this greedy way. And to punish him, Poseidon made Pasiphae fall madly in love with the bull. And so love, and women's love and affection, you'll see here in a lot of Greek myths, is one of the most effective forms of punishment. So love is this powerful entity that can be manipulated for power. Now, when the Minotaur was born, Minos did not kill him, and I don't know why. Instead, he had Daedalus, that great architect, that great inventor, put him in a labyrinth, right? To create a labyrinth so winding, so enormous that nobody could get out, right? You could wander endlessly the paths for the rest of your life and never find the exit. And so they create this labyrinth. And the only way to appease the beast within the labyrinth was defeated those 7 Athenians, 7 girls and 7 boys, to the Minotaur. Now Theseus said when he got to Athens, why, I'll slay the Minotaur. But he didn't say that. He said he would go, right? He said he would go and be one of the victims. And he didn't say he intended to slay the Minotaur, right? They all thought he was trying to just sacrifice himself for the good of the city. His father knew, of course, that Theseus intended to kill the bull. And Theseus said, I shall fly, I will come back on my boat after I have gone to the Minotaur. And after I'm coming back over the sea from Crete, I will put up a black sail if I have been killed. Like they will put up a black sail. And if I have survived, I will put up a white sail. Okay? And so King Aegeus would wait for his son, would wait for the ship, and wait for the color of the sail, so he would know immediately what had happened. It's really a beautiful image if you think about it. Okay. Now Theseus was warned by Ariadne, right, one of the spectators of Theseus, who saw Theseus and fell in love with him. And so she sent for Daedalus and said, show me a way for Theseus to get out of the labyrinth. Essentially, the love of a woman is what saves Theseus. He would have died if it were not for her interest in him. And Daedalus tells her to bring a little, or tells her to tell him to bring a little ball of yarn. And you hold the yarn as you go through, so you just follow the yarn out. It's kind of like, why didn't you think of that yourself? But, whatever. So he did this, right? And he walked boldly into the maze, looking for the Minotaur. He came upon him asleep and fell upon him, pinning to the ground, and with his fists, he had no other weapon, he battered the monster to death. As an oak tree falls on the hillside, crushing all that lies beneath, so Theseus, he presses out the life, the brute's savage life, and now it lies dead. Only the head sways slowly, but the horns are useless now. When Theseus lifted himself up from that terrific struggle, the ball of thread lay where he had dropped it. With it in his hands, the way out was clear. The others followed, and taking Ariadne with them, they fled to the ship and over the sea toward Athens. Okay. Now here there is a bit of confusion about whether on the ship home Theseus deserts Ariadne, or if he is blown out to sea and she dies while he is gone. But somehow Ariadne dies. And this is when the great accident occurs, right? And this is where we see, I think what Greek mythology shows us is that life is just a series of misunderstandings, and that everything in life happens when you make a choice without all the information. It happens when you don't understand all the things you don't know, right? To make the proper choice, you need to look at every detail, and that will ultimately be the thesis, I think, of the Bruegel painting, The Fall of Icarus, which is that you need to look at the outsides, at the margins of things. You can't just look at what the eye is drawn to. You have to think about every possibility, every eventuality. You can never stop paying attention, is essentially what it says. Okay? So, here we go. What happens is Theseus forgets to host the white sail. He forgets to put up the white sail. And Aegeus sees the black one. And he thinks his son is dead. And in such overwhelming sadness, he throws himself into the sea and drowns. And that is actually why we call the Aegean Sea, because that is where King Aegeus killed himself out of sorrow for his son. It's actually like a really beautiful sentiment. This kind of mythological king was torn up by the sight of a black sail, so devastated by the sight of a black sail that he hurls himself into the sea and dies. And so when Theseus returns, he is the king now of Athens, based merely on that black sail. The black sail is what brings him to the throne of Athens. And this is odd, because he is described as a very wise king, but also a disinterested king. Oh dear, I broke my book. Look, I broke the book. It's so old. It's an old book. But this book, for anyone reading books like The Wasteland or T.S. Eliot, or anyone who uses Greek allusions, need to have this one. Need to have this one for sure. Okay. He declared to the people, because he was disinterested, really, this is just, I don't really care for this. Probably he's a little sad because his father is dead, and also his wife, like everyone died. He did not want to rule them. He said, I don't want to rule you. I want you to have a people's government, and I want you to rule yourselves, is what he says. He wanted them all to be equal. He resigned his royal power and organized a commonwealth, building a council hall where the citizens should gather and vote. The only office he kept for himself was that of commander-in-chief, and thus Athens became, of all earth's cities, the happiest and most prosperous, the only true home of liberty, the one place in the world where the people governed themselves. So essentially, Athens became a democracy because the black sail was hoisted at the wrong time, and everything fell apart. And Theseus, pulling out of that suffering, does not care, does not wish to be king, does not wish for that specific duty. And rather than give it to another person who might rule with cruelty, he says, if I am not to be king, then you must be king. You all must be king. Every single one of you must take on the duty of ruling yourselves. I give you freedom. What will you do with it? It's a challenge, right? And so that's how Athens begins in this mythology as a democracy, due to the disinterest of a king, to the king saying, you know what, all this power isn't so great. I'd rather just, go seek some danger, right? But he was loved. He was a beloved king. He would never act violently out of retribution. If someone called him and said, there must be a great right or great wrong made right, rather than going and annihilating everyone, right, and then punishing people for making the wrong, he would merely right the wrong and then leave. And that's all. And so, for instance, when the Thebans refused to bury those of the enemy who had died, a terrible crime, right, at this time, the vanquished turned to Theseus in Athens for help. They said that free men under such a leader would never consent to leaving the helpless dead and wrong, that free men by their nature would be better, right, would be guided by morals, because if you do not have a great king to guide you, then you must be guided by morals, right, ideally. And so he led his army against Thebes, conquered her, and forced these people to be buried. But he did not return the evil upon the Thebes for what they had done. He refused to let his army enter to loot, and he did not harm Thebes. He merely buried those dead and left. And so he was the kind of person who only used violence when it was absolutely necessary, and never ever used it in order to conquer someone without reason. And not even without a reason that is falsified. So in many other stories, he shows the same qualities. When Hercules, in his madness, kills his whole family, right, his wife and his children, rather than pushing him away, as so many did, he gives Hercules a home, right? In his fire, he does not fear the pollution of the terrible deed. He does not push people away for their insanity, for their flaws. Instead, he says, "Come here. We have a place for you," right? He is essentially, as a country leader, a leader of a country, the person who says, "Bring me your weak, bring me your poor. This is the place where you will be safe," right? Because this is a place run by people, and people at their core are kind. And so that is what Theseus is to Athens. And so you can probably see so much connection between this kind of mythological king and what we had in our minds when we founded the United States, when the United States began as an oh so imperfect democracy. But of course, he loved danger for the sake of danger. Every person has their flaw. And so he would go off on these rather ridiculous things and ridiculous missions kind of and silly things, and they usually had to do with women, I wonder if I can kidnap this woman. Oh, maybe I can kidnap this woman. And so he gets a crazy idea with his friend that they're going to go down and kidnap Persephone in hell, or Persephone with Hades down in the underworld. And this is where Theseus meets the kind of first person who is able to stop him, which is Hades. And how does Theseus or Hades stop great Theseus, this great, powerful man? Forgetfulness. He stops him with the chair of forgetfulness. He actually sticks him in a chair and makes him forget everything, right? That is the power of forgetfulness, right? The most dangerous weapon, and this is what Greek mythology will tell us, it's what so much literature will tell us. The most dangerous weapon is the one you don't know is being used against you, right? Wars are now fought in the mind, right? The most deadly war is the one fought in the mind. He makes them forget their lives so they cannot move forward. He makes them forget their way so they cannot move forward. So Theseus, when he comes into the underworld to steal Persephone, Hades says, "Sit down." And Theseus does with his friend. They both sit down. And then they forget everything, right? Because he's put them in the chair of forgetfulness. And they stay there. They cannot move, right? His friend stays there for all of eternity. He never remembers. But luckily Theseus is rescued by his cousin. He comes and grabs him off the chair and says, "Remember, you fool." So that's what happens. So he gets into all of these silly things. And we won't go into his end, though it also involves love. But if we were to talk about Theseus, we'd be here for years. And I want to get to the painting, because the painting is so cool. So, eventually he dies. He was not a good death, right? He was killed by a king who was hosting him at the time, and no one really knows why. But after his death, the Athenians honored him with a great tomb and decreed that it should forever be a sanctuary for slaves and for all poor and helpless people, in memory of one who through his life had been the protector of the defenseless. So Theseus, the king, the leader of this great Athenian democracy, is considered the protector of the defenseless. And this is how democracy begins, with the concept that those who have nothing, who have nowhere else to go, are welcome here, right? That is the story of Theseus. Now I speak of this why, right? Because we're coming to Bruegel, or Bruegel. There's so many different ways to pronounce his name. He is a Dutch painter, so keep that in mind. I guess it's Bruegel. Bruegel. But in my accent, I just say Bruegel. The reason we talk about this because Bruegel makes a painting called The Fall of Icarus, which shows us how little people genuinely care about the suffering of others. We just don't, right? And that's what this poem reveals to us. So it's important to note that all of this, the thing that was slain in Daedalus's maze, was slain by Theseus, the great protector of the weak, the great protector of the poor, the protector of the weak and the poor, who creates and founds the Athenian democracy, kills the monster that Daedalus traps in a maze. And Daedalus, who is Daedalus? So let's now go to the fall, the myth of Icarus, which is deeply connected with the previous. Let us see where it is. I believe it's like 192. Yes, Daedalus. Okay. When Theseus had killed the Minotaur, Minos was convinced that the only way they could have found their way out was not by thinking up the fact that you could use a freaking ball of yarn yourself. No, he must have been told by Daedalus. This is true. So as a consequence, he sends Daedalus into the maze, right? And with his son, Icarus, into the labyrinth. Now here, of course, is when Minos learns you don't send a inventor into a labyrinth because they will find their way out. And this is how he did. He told his son, escape may be checked by water and land, but the air and sky are free. There's always a way out, right? You just have to look. And it is interesting because this invention would never have happened if it were not for an extraordinary problem, a suffering that exists. So it's much like we think of Dante when we think of suffering and the purpose of it. Well, yes, the purpose of suffering is to create. The purpose of suffering is to bring newness, right? Without suffering, there would be nothing. One could even argue that Athens would not have been the beautiful democracy it was if Theseus had not been so undone by the death of his father and the death of his wife. It had created in him that profound disinterest in being king, perhaps a disinterest with the power and glory of life, realizing, I cannot carry all of that on my back. I'd really like all of us to share in the burden of leading ourselves in this world. Okay, so he made 2 pairs of wings, and this is the story we all recognize, right? He warned Icarus as they were to fly out of the maze, not to fly too close to the sun. Do not test the limits of this invention. Do not test the limits of our ingenuity. But Daedalus so often disregards, the youth so often disregards the message of the adults. So keep that in mind. Right? The separation between the youth and the elders is so often what spells our undoing. The inability of the generations to communicate to each other, right, is kind of what this myth is saying. Daedalus warns, the youth does not listen, right? And so Icarus instead soars exultingly up and up, paying no heed to his father's anguished commands. Then he fell. The wings had come off. He dropped into the sea, and the waters closed over him. The afflicted father flew safely to Sicily, where he was received kindly by the king. And that is really all we need to know about that. Okay, now we'll transition to the painting The Fall of Icarus by Bruegel, which I think you will like. So let me turn around the camera. I'm going to show you the black and white, but I'm also going to put over for a moment the color version, because you do need to see the colors in order to fully take in this painting. Okay, so let's switch it around now. Okay, let me change that up a little bit. All right, here we are. This is my favorite painting ever painted. This is in the museum, the Royal Museum in Brussels. It is by Bruegel, who is who was a Dutch painter in the 16th century. He painted this in 1555, I think. And it's the landscape of the fall of Icarus. Now, Bruegel painted in a time where merely just painting biblical scenes had gone a bit out of fashion. And so instead he focused very intensely on landscapes. And he did still integrate biblical and mythological elements into his paintings. But the odd thing was they were never the focal point. They were always additions to the modern life or the contemporary life of his time of 16th century Flanders, the place where he liked to paint. And so I'll show you here. I took some notes, some very messy notes. All right. He didn't depict biblical history like an illustrator in a book, but rather he took history and placed it in his contemporary time. He took myths and made it as if they happened not in the past, but alongside us. He made history and mythology the present, right? And so I'll write that down. He made history and mythology the present, the past into the present. But you'll notice that this was often happening in the margins. Okay, so let's look carefully at this painting to see what his thesis is. He's a painter who had a very strong thematic purpose to his work. Bruegel the Elder was what he was called. So here you'll see the red, and I'm going to overlay the colored picture now so you can see the colors. The red here, right, so I'm just going to write, is going to draw your eye. It's the focal point. The center of the painting you would expect to be Icarus. It's a painting about the fall of Icarus. And yet the center of this painting is a man pushing his, what is that, tiller? Pushing his tiller, not even looking at where Icarus is. Where is Icarus? You follow the red. So he creates a sort of triangle of perspective, a triangulation. You go from red hat to red hat, and then you come up, boom, there's Icarus. There are his legs, just above the smaller man's red hat. His legs, there is the drowning Icarus, the Icarus that fell into the sea and died. You'll notice all the people around who did not notice or did not care that a great feat had just occurred and also a great suffering had endured. So a great feat occurred, a great suffering endured, and all is going on business as usual, right? So what this painting is showing us here is that we don't care. Ultimately, we don't care that suffering, the details of another's life are always going on in the periphery of our own, no matter how extraordinary that life must be, right? He flew. He created wings and flew. But does the man plowing the fields care? Does the man here care? No, no one cares at all. And this is commonly a theme of his paintings, which is that ultimately we do not care about the great achievements of man. We do not care about the great suffering of man. We care so much less than we say we do. And it's in a lot of ways a very shocking painting. It shows us that in the wide scope of the world, all of these occurrences are small and mundane, right? the mundane continues. These blips of extraordinary are ultimately very small in the corners of paintings. You would miss them if you did not know to look. What is extraordinary is only extraordinary if you define it, if you look at it at that time. Okay? We do not see the drowning man. Plowing continues even as the man drowns. Now, this is a common theme. Before we get to the ekphrastic poetry based off of this painting that will explain it more, we can look now to some other paintings that he made, and primarily that one being here. This is the census at Bethlehem. For those of you who don't know, this is another painting where he took biblical history and merely plopped it in 16th century Flanders. You see the snow, you see all of these people lining up for the census. Now the census was there to charge taxes in Bethlehem on the people, and the census is what brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem when Mary was pregnant with a son. And so you see the census occurring here. More obvious, however, right? You have this kind of bird's eye view. It's not a godlike view, but it's certainly not a human perspective. It feels as if like a bird is looking out at a village, and there's no focal point in this one. This one's different than the other. There does not feel to be a focal point in this. It is merely chaos, and it'd be very hard to determine what it is, to know that this is a biblical scene transposed into 16th century Flanders. But this one is much more obvious, much more related to the fall of Icarus. Here is chaos. Again, no focal point. Your eye is drawn immediately to chaos, though you may notice the symmetry of these spears here. They are all lined up in perfect parallel. So there is a place of order in the chaos. And who is the order in the chaos? Those that have been called to murder all the young boys under the age of 2. This is a depiction of the massacre of the innocents in Flanders, where, of course, King Herod, and I put it right here for us to look at, for those of you who are not biblical scholars like me, I am not a biblical scholar at all. King Herod orders the killing of all boys under the age of 2 because he has been told a child destined to become the king of Jews was born in the city. And of course, Jesus is saved by fleeing to Egypt, but so many are lost because of the fear of the loss of power. And so the story here goes, right? And we'll read about it in a poem. But the story here goes that you have all of this suffering, people begging at the soldiers' feet. You have children hung on spears, this dead child dangling from a spear there. And yet you have dogs happily playing, and you have horses, the innocent horses of the torturer's innocent horses rubbing its behind on a tree. Right? That's a line from a poem. You have all of this simplicity, these animals who just do not care. What seems so important is a mere blip in the life of a world. Right? So it really talks about how perspective can change the meaning of literally everything. Right? You change your perspective, you change the way everything looks, feels, exists. And so, we'll look now at a poem. This is an Auden poem, and I have a bit to say about Auden before we read. He wrote this poem when he was only 31 years old, which is incredible, right? That's a year younger than I am, and he's writing a poem this good. And Auden was very much a student of the time period he was living in. So this was written in, if I remember correctly, let me look, 1936, 1938. He wrote this poem in 1938. Of course, World War II, we can't keep that out of our minds. He traveled often, and he saw and witnessed so much of war and wrote about it in his poems. He saw tension, he saw war, so on and so forth. This is a picture of him at about the time he wrote this poem as a 31-year-old man. He's not a boy. So this is a nice picture of Auden. He seemed like a nice man. And he went to a museum in Brussels where Bruegel's paintings were, and he saw them here in this room. And after attending this museum, he sat down after looking at the painting I just showed you, and essentially he wrote this brilliant poem about the Theseus that Bruegel gave us. And this is the museum at the time in which he went. This is 1930s Brussels. You can see the old car here in 1930s Brussels. This is the Royal Museum of Brussels, Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, where the Bruegel paintings are. So if any of you have ever had the privilege of seeing them in the flesh, I'm very jealous. So here is the image of the museum at the time in which he visited it. But he wrote this poem after, and it's a great poem because it really has its own kind of thesis, just like the painting does. And so what he wrote about most often was the rising threat of totalitarianism in the 20th century. And so he was clearly inspired by those paintings to see some of the realities of totalitarianism, the kind of apathy, perhaps, the kind of I think mostly apathy that allows totalitarianism to take place, that leads the sleepiness of people, I think, is what leaves it to. And so the sleepiness of people, the failure to act, the failure to pay attention, so the sleepiness, the failure to pay attention. Or one could even say the tendency to act. To act without knowing. To act on blind faith. Without seeking first the knowledge to ground it. All of this really leads to totalitarianism. That's a lot of T's in totalitarianism. It's a big word. But let's read it. Okay. And then we'll just analyze it in comparison with the painting. About suffering they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. So, what do we say now? How do we think about what he has said. We start at the beginning, I suppose. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. And so who is he speaking of? Obviously he's speaking of Bruegel. He's speaking of all the people of Daedalus, right? Of all these people who know. They know. These are the people who know, who have lived and worn, right? That is so, so important. About suffering, they know what suffering is. Young people very rarely think they know. Well, they think they know, but they very rarely understand what suffering is because they don't have that perspective of time. But of course, not all old people, right? It's the people who have made the effort to understand the life they have lived. And not all old people do that, right? And some young people do that. The old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. Suffering is so often confined, right? By one's attention, right? I may suffer, but another is mine and does not care of my suffering. My suffering is not enough to make someone act to reduce it, right? How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there must always be children who did not specially want it to happen. Now, this is the painting about the massacre of the innocent, right? Because we see the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth of Jesus, of course. But the children would not want Jesus to be born, because for Jesus to be born, if he is born, they must be killed, right? They would not want Jesus to be born. They do not particularly care. They are happily skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They don't understand the world. They are innocent. But they never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot, and that untidy spot is, of course, Bethlehem, where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturous horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. So let's look back then. Right. Here it is. The dogs go on with their doggy life, and the horse scratches its innocent behind on the tree. They are participants, not knowing participants. They are the innocents, right? The innocents are massacring the innocents. All according to the desires of some greater power that nobody even sees. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away. Before we move on from that, I want to return to the Edith Hamilton real quick, because she does speak rather intelligently about this. Here we go. So she speaks about how in these books, right, or in these myths, because they're so early, no distinction has been made between the real and the unreal, as you see here. The imagination was vividly alive and not checked by reason. And we do see that in the Bruegel, where he's taken the past and he's just kind of supplanted it in the present, for us to see how these biblical disasters, these mythological disasters, play over and over and out and out and out over in our lives, and we very rarely see them or pay attention. But here we go. What she said is that these uncivilized peoples, as she would call it, because this was written, of course, much older. The belief, what these myths did was make life more beautiful. They made the qualities of man, of humanity, bigger, more beautiful, more spectacular, right? That anyone in the woods might see through the trees a fleeing nymph or bending over a clear pool to drink, behold in the depths of Naiad's face. It is a delightful state, a beautiful state. It is like a perpetual garden. And yet, right, for every bit of light, there is darkness, right? Behind everything lies its opposite. It's one of my favorite lines. I don't know where it comes from, but it is true. There is a negative to every image, right? So, and we for a moment catch through the mist he made a glimpse of that strangely and beautifully animated world. Myths he made, she's speaking of Homer. But a brief consideration of the ways of uncivilized people everywhere and in all ages is enough to prick that romantic bubble. Nothing is clearer than the fact that primitive man, whether in New Guinea today or eons ago, yeah, see, that's a bit of the time period in which this book was written. I wouldn't call New Guinea primitive anymore. It's a bit, 1942 is when this was written. The way we spoke about different cultures was racist, but there you go. So we'll just strike that from the record. Okay. And nothing is clearer than the fact that primitive man is not and never has been a creature who peoples his world with bright fancies and lovely visions. Okay? We don't choose the good. We don't choose the beautiful. So often we are drawn to the grotesque. Horrors lurked in the primeval forest, not nymphs and naiads. Terror lived there with its close attendant, magic, and its most common defense, human sacrifice. What an odd thing to say, right? Mankind's chief hope of escaping the wrath of whatever divinities were then abroad lay in some magical rite, senseless but powerful, or in some offering made at the cost of pain and grief. There is the idea that for our salvation we pay in suffering. And this is not just the case in Christian theology. It is so much of these mythologies. Even in the Mayan, right? When we think about Mayans, they did have a profound practice of human sacrifice that colonizers looked at as disturbing. And yet, in ours, we have the sacrifice of all boys under the age of 2. Sacrifice just looks different now, right? In order for us to thrive, we must sacrifice another country's young, right? But we don't think about it as sacrifice. We don't think of it as a barbaric quality. Why? I don't know. What this book would say, or what this text would say, is we don't think about it as a barbaric sacrifice because we're not looking at it. Right, when we think about the Mayan human sacrifice of taking a child and slaughtering it, right, that's one. The death of one is so much more powerful than the death of many. An odd logical conundrum, right, about our perception. If we look at this book here, C.S. Lewis has a really disturbing quote about that reality. So here's C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, which of course is a Catholic text. He says, "We must never make the problem of pain worse than it is by vague talk about the unimaginable sum of human misery. Suppose that I have a toothache of intensity X, and suppose that you, who are seated beside me, also begin to have a toothache of intensity X. You may, if you choose, say that the total amount of pain in the room is now 2X, but you must remember that no one is suffering 2X. Search all time and space, and you will not find the composite pain in anyone's consciousness. There is no such thing as a sum of suffering, for no one suffers it. essentially that the pain of one is equal to the pain of thousands, is what he is saying here. When we have reached the maximum that a single person can suffer, we have no doubt reached something very horrible, but we have reached all the suffering there ever can be in the universe. The addition of 1,000,000 fellow sufferers adds no more pain, that the suffering of one is equal to the suffering of all. By increasing the number of suffering, we do not increase our... I don't know how to say this. It's such a darkly kind of pessimistic statement, but it rings true to me, because I do feel that if we were to watch a person die in front of us, it would be catastrophic, traumatizing. And yet if we hear that 1,000 have died somewhere else, we simply go on. We just go on. And that is one of the oddest things about humanity. And that is what Bruegel is saying here in these paintings, right? The death of 1,000 unseen is nothing compared to the death of one seen, right? And so that's what makes this painting so powerful. It's the death of one that no one witnesses. An extraordinary death has no effect on this person, right? He is the suffering of only one. And that glorious human achievement that failed, we all turn away and do not care. If he had succeeded, nobody would have known. And he failed, and no one cares. Great things happen. Great people exist. We do not care. We move on. Sometimes we take a minute to tear them down. But for the most part, we move on with our lives. They pop in and pop out. And so this is the problem of people, right? We believe that in order for our own selves to succeed, in order to have our own happiness, someone must suffer. That is the cornerstone of our belief. That is the concept of human sacrifice, right? And we don't think about it as barbaric anymore. This is where we realize that I'm an idiot. I don't remember how to spell sacrifice. Oh no. Luckily it's in this book. It's all a lie. Sacrifice. It is an I. Oh my God. Somebody needs to put me out of my misery. Okay, human sacrifice. That essentially human sacrifice is a practice that we undergo now, just in much larger numbers, so it doesn't feel barbaric anymore. When it's in large numbers, somehow it doesn't feel barbaric. Well, in order for us to thrive, we must remove a significant portion of our population. It doesn't matter if they die or not. That's just how it is. That in order for our country to thrive, this country must suffer, their young must die. Right? That is the way that we think about things. Our flourishing depends on their sacrifice. They sacrifice themselves for our good. This is the only way we know how to navigate the world. Why on earth can we not find a new way to navigate the world? That's all I ask. Yeah, so this comes to that important statement. If we look at now the last stanza, because this is what he said. The dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Some must be martyrs for the best of us all. We must have that sacrifice, that human sacrifice, in order for the world to continue. Everything turns away so leisurely, right? Leisurely. So much comfort, so much mundanity in that leisure. From the disaster, the ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to, and this is wonderful. There's a sense of everything must go on. There is no other way, right? The bureaucracy of evil is another thing that we could get to. Hannah Arendt, really brilliant text. but as it had to, and the white legs disappearing into the green water. And the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing. Right? Look over there. But we had somewhere to get to, so we did not stop and look. What an amazing moment there is. But can the world stop and look at the beauty? No. It is too busy running away from a horror to notice that actually everything around us is gorgeous. Right? We are too busy running from horrors, and so many, to see what is so amazing. And actually, I don't like what I said, because I don't think that the ship is running from horrors. The ship is just trying to do something small. We're dedicated to these small acts, and we don't notice the big ones. Actually, I'm not even sure if that's what it is. It's kind of hard to say. What I got from other readings of this is that this poem is ultimately about the relationship between attention and disaster. Something is only a disaster if we notice it. And so it only becomes important if our eyes rest upon it, right? Or the edges are part of the picture. Ignoring them is a moral failure. To ignore those who suffer at our fringes is a failure. They are not sacrifices to our own comfort, and it's kind of what it feels like. We feel like those on the fringes are sacrifices for the sake of our own comfort, which might perhaps be the statement we make. But it's also a story, because I told you the story of Icarus, and I told you the story of the king of Athens, right? So it's also that story of human ingenuity. And what happens when human ingenuity fails? That we disregard it. We're kind of disturbed or disgusted by it. That failure has along with it such a stench. But there cannot be those great achievements without that failure. But it's also important to note that Theseus, right, the king that's so associated with Icarus, that's associated through the story of Daedalus, he is the man who would not be the ruler for the world that this depicts, right? He is the ruler that sees all of the suffering. He looks at the failure of Hercules and says, "Come with me." So Theseus is the ruler that lives to show us a different world, right, that is possible. A world different from this painting, one of a dedication to the mundane and a rejection of the amazing aspects of life, a rejection of all, really rejection of paying attention, right? It's that, as I said with Auden, it's that trend towards totalitarianism, how it is built on apathy, right? Theseus was a king that went against apathy, who accepted. Where did I write it? I can't remember. I wrote down. Oh, sorry, here. Right, that apathy leads to totalitarianism. The inability to pay attention to detail leads to totalitarianism. The sleepiness of people, the failure to pay attention. That is what this painting is about. It's telling us that if you do not pay attention, you will miss the glory of life. You will miss all that is going on, and you will allow someone else to take over your life. Some other routine, some other thing, some mundanity, essentially. It's kind of what these paintings are saying. But it also really is the kind of hopeless cycle, right? When you think about how these myths still apply, there's a sense that nothing's really changed, I think. That we can keep telling ourselves that we study history so as not to repeat it. But I don't think that's really played out. I think we study history to understand how the history is really the present. Nothing ever dies, nothing ever leaves. Now we'll look at this last one, because Auden wrote a poem about the fall of Icarus. So did William Carlos Williams. I'll write down his name. And actually, he published a book of poems based off of Bruegel's paintings himself in 1962. Yes, in 1962. And just a year before he died, so it was actually the last book of poems he wrote. He was a famous modernist poet and a famous imagist poet. And imagism is focused on using the luminous details of a thing to tell a story, to tell its story. So it rejected over-explaining. It tended to focus on these shorter, more experimental structures. So it was always free verse, stuff like that. So you have these kind of tercets here. But each tercet is so few words, almost like in a bunch of connected haikus. So very much focused on brevity and pulling out small details and letting small details show us the world that exists inside him. The luminous details that exist in the smallest of things is essentially what this is about. So we'll just end with this poem because it's a very different poem than the one, and this video is getting very long, so we'll wrap it up. I won't talk about this one too much. But according to Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. A farmer was ploughing his field. The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling near, the edge of the sea concerned with itself, sweating in the sun that melted the wings' waths. Unsignificantly off the coast, there was a splash quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. And so you see here, this is another thesis that resembles the other. The insignificance of human suffering. The edge of the sea that was so concerned with itself, right? The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling near, concerned with itself, not with what drowned inside of it. No, only concerned with itself, the rest insignificant. This is what we are. We are concerned with ourselves, the rest insignificant. And what a terribly, terribly difficult thing it is to do, to fight constantly the impulse within us to look at so much of the grandness of life as insignificant and unrelated to ourselves. So that there is what impresses me so much about Bruegel's paintings. And if you know this painting, you probably do. It's quite famous. Let me know your thoughts on it. If you've seen it, I'm jealous. But thank you for joining me for this kind of long and very rambling video. Just kind of went all kinds of different directions. But I hope you have a lovely sleep, or you're already asleep. And all I have to say is night-night, everyone. Sleep well.